Wait for it, and we're live. Welcome back. Hey, all you crazy sci-fi and fantasy fans. It's time for your daily dose of shenanigans over here at the Blasters and Blades podcast. Just three nerdy veterans geeking out over our science fiction passions and fantastical fantasies. A place where magic is king, the sky is the limit, and space is the place. We are the podcast that puts the fun in dysfunction. So without further ado, we're going to allow Mr. L.N. Hunter to introduce himself. So, Mr. Hunter, can you tell us who you are and what you do for our listeners and viewers?
Hi, as he's already said, I'm L.N. Hunter. I'm an author mainly of short stories, but I've got one novel which I'm quite proud of, The Feather and the Lamp, a comic fantasy which I like to think is somewhat in the vein of Terry Pratchett. During daylight hours, I'm a software engineer, but it's much more fun writing in the evenings and weekends. Apart from that, I'm a fairly boring person.
Wait, software engineer, are you designing AI to take over and create Skynet?
Using it, but not designing it. Trying to make it something that people can work with rather than work against. There's been quite a lot of success in using AI with humans, particularly in things like medical scanning. I think that's something to look at rather than, as people see it, competition for human talent.
Okay, so you're not creating Skynet yet. Would you tell us if you were?
Not yet. Not deliberately. Who knows what might happen by
accident. Okay, that's fair. All right, and because this is the Blasters and Blades podcast, first I have to tell you how I found them, dear listener, dear viewer. Is we got the introduction from ye old hillbilly of Three Ravens Publishing, and when the Viking with the beard says "do this," you just kind of do it because he gives you mead, and who says no to good mead? So. I can be bribed, people. That's what I'm telling you. Good meat, and I'll be bribed. And with that out of the way, the religion question, sir. Are you ready? Do you need a deep breath, cup of coffee, mug of tea? Okay. Star Wars, Star Trek, or Firefly?
Well, I think the first thing I've got to say is that although I'm not a fan of the Big Bang Theory, it did have one line that really resonated. There is one episode, I can't remember what argument's going on, but Penny stage whispers to someone, "You know the big secret, Star Wars and Star Trek, they're the same thing." I really like that. I came across Star Wars first, so I think I'm probably more of a Star Wars fan than Star Trek, but then the prequels came, and that maybe changed the balance. Firefly, I was a very late comer to. I actually watched a few episodes maybe a couple of months ago. That was my first contact with it. It's kind of fun. But as some people have said, it's awfully white for a universe where the universal language is Chinese. But as Penny said, they're all kind of the same thing. There, I've managed to offend all three populations.
Okay, I mean, if you're going to go big, if you're going to go out, go big, I guess. Okay, I could. Yeah, I think they did the Chinese language for the cursing just so they can get around,
Yes, that was inventive. I like that.
And instead of going the whole Battlestar, excuse me, the Battlestar Galactica of was it fracking and
yes, which sounds kind of strange given that fracking is a thing.
Yeah, and I mean, F word isn't the only cuss word out there. So if you're going to make up cuss words, you need more than just one. Yes. I mean, there are plenty of others, and they only made the one. It's like it was low effort on the fake cussery, I guess.
I'm quite a fan of the Judge Dredd comics, and I like the nonsense they've got in there. It's the grok for God, or grud rather, by grud, and other random pseudo swear words. It's all quite silly.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting discussion about adding swear words to fiction that they did over at the Writers Dojo. Now, that's, dear listener, more geared towards actual authors, but it's still worth listening to that episode. And they talk about how, sometimes you can go a little overboard, I think, with the made up stuff. But if you're going to make up cuss words, you got to keep in mind the society that they're coming from, because what's a curse to one person might not be to another society. So it's definitely an interesting thing, and I think the writers at BSG, for all I love that series, could have done better on that one. So what's your take? Do you add cuss words to your fiction, or do you just make words up, or skip it altogether?
I've done both. A lot of my writing is comic, and there I tend to um, not use any explicit swearing, but make up some ridiculous insults like malodorous son of a camel. Um, Other times I'm going for shock value, and I'll drop in a few bombs. But yeah, it depends on the story and the audience.
Okay, that makes sense. And because we are polytheistic for the religion questions, Game of Thrones, Wheel of Times, or Lord of the Rings?
That's a tough one. I used to like epic fantasy. I would gobble up a Thomas Covenant or something over a week, but I've kind of gone off that. So I would have to say none of the above. Um, I thought the Lord of the Rings films were overlong, and The Hobbit was way too much. I quite like the Hobbit book, quite a light, easy read. But I don't know how they managed to get 3 films out of that. Um, I've read some of Game of Thrones, but kind of got fed up after about the third volume and never actually tuned into the TV program. Um, Likewise, the other. I've read some Robert Jordan, but I couldn't build up the enthusiasm to tune into it. I don't have the attention span anymore.
Okay.
I think it was probably round about the time Terry Pratchett appeared that I lost my liking for epic fantasy and just latched onto his style of moderately light but very comic fantasy.
Okay. Do you like the comedy of the absurd, or do you like it to be more highbrow? Like, what's your style preference?
I'm definitely lowbrow all the way. Um, it's definitely the comedy. I also quite like his subtle or not so subtle analogies to the real world. I'd like to have enough skill to do that myself, but at the moment I'm focusing on the comedy.
Okay. So what was your first experience then with speculative fiction? Like, how did you discover your love of the genre? Because I mean, you didn't just start and say, "I've never read anything, but I'm going to write a novel." So what was your journey to get to where you are today?
It was a long and very slow journey. I never really saw myself as a writer when I was growing up. Um, in the time and place I was at school, we pretty much had to make a decision between arts and sciences at round about age 15, and then once you're on one of those paths, that was it. I was good at science sorts of things. I enjoyed them, so that's where I went for a lot of years and had a good time. But I never really thought about writing anything other than software for a very long time. Um, for various reasons, I decided to do a distance learning psychology degree when I was at work. It was something to do to keep my brain ticking over. I think it might have been around about the same sort of time I was starting to work on artificial neural networks. So I figured it'd be interesting to find out about real ones. One module in that was phenomenology, which the way it was described in the textbooks was almost like writing a vignette. And I thought, this is weird. What's this doing in a scientific course? That kind of lit the fuse. Um, as one module in this course, we had a free choice of pretty much anything, and just for fun, I did a creative writing module, and that was a blast. Um, the first few short stories that I had published came directly out of that course, and then I started churning out short stories, maybe a quarter of which had been published so far. And really enjoyed that. Now, my background in reading had been science fiction, starting with people like Asimov and Nancy Kress and Silverberg and the like. Then, through some of the fantasy works we talked about already, Michael Moorcock. I remember reading an awful lot of Michael Moorcock. And then, I guess, Terry Pratchett and Douglas Adams landed, not necessarily in that order. And I really liked both of their works. And I think that has almost certainly affected how I write as well. So yes, it was a long journey, starting off in the wrong direction, and then kind of accidentally coming across this idea that I could write, and then I tried it and found it lots of fun.
That is a good way to do it. So Do you have a preference if you had to pick between sci-fi and fantasy? Do you love them both pretty equally?
I think pretty equally, and I think I'd be inclined to blur the boundary between them. There are a lot of sciencey sorts of ideas in Terry Pratchett's work, where he twists science around and kind of makes it fit into that world, and I think I've done some of that in The Feather and the Lamp. I hope I'm not slavishly copying Pratchett ideas, but I also think things like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is really a fantasy that happens in space. I mean, in some sense, Star Wars is a space fantasy. So in the sorts of sci-fi and fantasy that I read, there is, or that I read and like, there is a blurring between the boundaries. I don't maybe read an awful lot of hard science fiction, and as I've said before, I'm not really a fan of epic fantasy. So I cheat and sit in the middle and smush everything together.
Okay. Well, I mean, the concept that they are entirely distinct, I think, is a relatively modern thing. In the past, it was just speculative fiction was the bookshelf, and then, there became more books, so you needed to organize them a little bit more granularly, and then sort of add in electronic sales, and it's off to the races. Yeah. I will be curious to see if there's ever any data to say how that affected reading habits. Are people reading more narrowly now, or like us growing up, where you read whatever the library had, you couldn't be that picky, so you just read all of it?
No, I think in terms of going to the library or going to physical bookshops, a book sits on one shelf. If it's been labeled as fantasy, that's the fantasy shelf. So you don't see the sci-fi stuff because it's not on the shelf you're looking at. I think now with categories rather than with tags rather than categories, there's more of a mix. So I think maybe it's the opposite, that there's more mixing now than there might have been pre-internet.
I see what you're saying, but before there was the sci-fi and the fantasy shelf, there was just the speculative fiction, where it was all grouped together to start with. Back in the pulp era, they didn't necessarily separate it all out. And then as that evolved, I just wonder if that narrows people's reading. But then again, when I went to the library, it was just alphabetical order. YA fiction, adult fiction, whatever. They didn't separate it out by like genre. So for when I would go to the library, because that's where I read most of my books growing up, is whatever was there that I hadn't read yet. And yes. So after a while, you just go to the just in section and see if what appeals to you.
But I guess then as well, there were fewer books, so there was less to pick between. It also feels like in years gone by, science fiction was more sciencey and fantasy was more fantasy-y. Maybe it's a relatively modern thing that they mingle a bit. I don't know. I'm just waffling.
This could be an interesting discussion if we have a historian of fiction. I might have to track that down and see what's out there for guests, because it is interesting to see where, because when you write fiction in the modern world, you're standing on the shoulders of all the giants that came before you. So it is kind of an interesting dive to look in to see like the trajectory of all of that.
Yes, I wonder if there's anything in the data that places like Amazon collect on book sales. If that
it would be interesting. So have you met any of the writers of some of the more classic styles of books? Like, have you met Terry Pratchett or any of those type authors?
No, I'm afraid I've met no one. Like I said, I was a late starter and haven't really managed to go to many places to meet anyone at all. Okay. I think that the point at which I decided I was going to focus on writing was pretty much when the pandemic hit. All the working from home and not being able to go out stuff meant I had plenty of time for writing. And that was probably a bad time to think about conventions and the like.
I was actually more thinking even before you were a writer, if you had just in the course of your life met any of the more iconic authors.
No, sadly not. I left it way too late for Douglas Adams and Terry Pratchett, who I think are on top of my list.
I got go ahead.
As a reader, I was more interested in the work than the people. It's only, I guess, recently I've thought that much about who authors really are.
Yeah. I had the privilege of meeting Pat Conroy. He came to speak to my college English class. And then same with Robert Jordan. who was a really nice guy. Met him, I guess, when I was in college in 2003. So it's definitely interesting. I don't think I've met anyone else, although, you know, I've talked to them through the podcast. I don't know if that counts with some of the bigger names.
It's still more than I've done. Actually,
Well,
a funny little story. When my daughter was reading the Alex Rider books, the author, whose name I've gone blank on at the moment, came to visit the school, except only the year above her, so she wasn't allowed to go and talk to her favorite author at the time.
oh, that's just rude.
Mm.
I might have had some words to say too if I was her. Did she come out all right, or was she emotionally scarred forever?
I think she survived, and she read everything else he'd ever written.
Perfect.
It wasn't too bad.
So was there any one thing that inspired you to start writing other than just, you know, I'm stuck at home with the pandemic and I want to do things?
It was that creative writing course that I mentioned, which I'd finished shortly before the pandemic hit. Okay, this might sound weird, but one of the things it came from was just a permission to write. I'd never really thought about doing writing myself, but one of the messages in the course was, just do it. There's nothing stopping you. And then I tried it and it was fun. And that trivial trigger was enough to start things.
Wow, it helps if you unmute. I had some really gold. I'm sure it was the most sophisticated thing anyone's ever, or in this case, never heard. But oops. So I can see how that works. Like, I actually started writing myself through a writing as therapy class at the VA, the Veterans Hospital. And so I think sometimes you get in your own way when you're starting, and sometimes just having someone be like, yeah, you could do this is all you really need. For me, I always thought, like, I had this sort of grandiose idea of what an author was. So I remember I had written a short story, and they were like, this is good. You should consider publishing this. And I remember telling, it was a professor from the College of William and Mary that was visiting or volunteering her time to do this class. And it wasn't even an official class. It's just something they did. She's like, JR, you've been to 2 war zones. What more life do you want? And I'm like, oh, okay. You know, but like growing up reading military writers, it was like Tim or Tom O'Brien, the guy that wrote The Things They Carried. And so, you know, you compare your experiences to theirs, right? And it's like, well, how do you stack up to that? So anyway.
Yes, it just takes someone saying, you can do it, just go for it and see what happens.
Yeah, it's sometimes can be liberating. So for those of you listening who are thinking about writing, because most of our listeners are readers instead, but if you want to think about it, consider this your permission to do it. The world
Absolutely.
needs more good books in it.
And don't hide it away. Put it in front of people.
Absolutely. All right, so let's talk about your book, The Feather and Lamp. First off, I'm going to throw the cover up. So what is the story of this? Because this has somewhat of a more classic vibe to the cover than you see in modern fantasy. Was that intentional?
I hadn't really thought about it all that much in those terms. It's just that one of the features of the book was a dragon who flies through quantum dimensions. He produces his wings transform into this ruby shell around him, and then he pops out of existence and appears somewhere else. And that was one of the main features of the book, and it just had to be on the cover. And there's a feather in it and a lamp, which gives you the graphics at the bottom. Beyond that, I gave the ideas to an artist friend, and he produced a few designs, and I like this one best. I hadn't really thought about it in terms of what fantasy books really look like. Okay. And the book is perhaps more oriented towards comedy than fantasy. It's definitely very light fantasy, so I guess that's my excuse as well.
Well, I really do like it. It's nice. Here, let me show, dear listener, if you're watching this at home, so you can see this dragon sort of encased in it looks like it could be a amber or a jewel or a ruby of some sort, which also, you know, kind of appears as the sun. The text on the top for his typeface is very typewriter-esque, which I really, really like. And then the watercolor painting vibe with the boat on the water and the mountains in the background I really like. And then if you zoom in, because you got high def, you can see the layers that they did on the art, which is kind of neat. It gives some dimensionality to, and if that's not a word it should be, Oxford Dictionary gives on that. But it gives some depth to the water. And it gives a sensation of motion. And then, the actual novel text writing doesn't look that different than some of what I've seen when I worked in the archives transcribing newspapers from the 1700s. And of course, the lamp that sets the tone.
A lot of my software development experience has been working with a lot of talented designers. I got an appreciation for the thinking that goes behind producing something attractive. If you look at a bit of software's UI, you can tell if it's been designed by an engineer or by a designer. There's skill in making something attractive. So I kind of let him loose on this, and he's done a really good job. I mean, I wouldn't have thought of the difficulty of selecting the best fonts for it, but he's managed to do that.
And that's the other thing people don't realize is some fonts are actually trademarked. And so everyone's just like, oh, I'll just use this font because it looks good. Better make sure you have permission. I never would have considered that until I started publishing. I'm like, wait a minute, there are trademarked fonts? I just thought they were all free.
Yes.
Because when you're just doing your school papers, no one cares. And it's just whatever's loaded into the system, Yep,
absolutely.
All right. So do you have a preferred font since we're talking fonts? Let's be really nerdy here.
In terms of producing manuscripts, I'm really boring, and it's Times New Roman. That's maybe not the best font for writing and reading, but it was the one that was the standard in the creative writing course that I mentioned. So I kind of got used to it. People say that reading stuff on screen, a sans serif font is better, but I've just got used to Times New Roman. When it comes to final layout, I leave the choice of font to people more talented and more experienced than me.
Yeah, I'm a Times New Roman or bust. I used to do Times New Roman 12 because that was a standard all through schooling, and my writing training came from the academic side because I was a history major. But now that I'm getting older, it's Times New Roman 14 or bust. I up the sizes.
Why not 12 point and zoom in a bit further?
I do both. I do the 14 and zoom in. But part of that's
double spaced, of course.
I've gotten used to doing the single space now, although it took years. I mean, I started writing in 2015 for the novel that published in 2016, and it's taken years of writing to get used to that one space instead of two. And if I don't think, like if I'm having a bad brain day, sometimes I still do two without thinking about it, just because years of muscle memory.
Yes.
So it's one of those things where it's just like whatever the training was. But the one that gives me the most is people that use like Comic Sans or Arial. I'm like, no, that's impossible to read. Stop.
Arial is not too bad on a decent display. I don't fully understand everyone's objection to Comic Sans. It's quite a fun little font. It's not that difficult to read in small bursts. I don't think I'd like an entire novel in it, but I don't think it deserves all the abuse that it gets.
I just can't stand it. But I'm coming at it with the head injury that, I've got to make some allowances for. So who knew getting blown up 37 times was bad for your health?
Strange that.
Weird. That wasn't on the recruiting poster either. I don't know why they forgot that part. So
I've only written one bit of vaguely military fiction, and in that one, the hero does get blown up an awful lot.
It doesn't feel good, but not dying is kind of cool. So there's that. What now? When they get blown up in the fiction that you did write, where was it magical explosions or was it more modern sci-fi world?
It was sci-fi, but it was somewhat satirical. Actually, not somewhat, very satirical. First time he gets blown up, he loses a few limbs, but the military replace his arms with gorilla arms to make really tough soldiers. Second time he gets blown up, there isn't quite enough of his body to bring back to do that, so they plonk his head on a chimpanzee's body, and then it gets a bit more bizarre.
Okay, chimpanzee, you say?
Yeah.
I mean that's bizarre to start with. So
well, the advantages of that I gave in the book is that the soldiers can hang on to things with one arm and hold weapons in the other three limbs. This wasn't serious sci-fi in the slightest.
Yeah. Okay, but then how do they aim? Do they got an extra eye?
I kind of hand wave past important details.
Well, as long as the story's entertaining, we'll forgive a lot. Okay. So you mentioned that you started writing The Feather in the Lamp when COVID lockdown happened. So what was the inspiration for the title? And how did, what was the origin story of this novel?
Okay, so it had its roots maybe a few years before that, as part of this writing course that I've mentioned already. I wrote I can't remember whether it was a short story or a play script that had the basic skeleton of this in maybe 2,500 words. And someone who'd critiqued it said, "This is quite good. I'd like to see some more of it." Um, and I think over the years, I collected an awful lot of episodes that could kind of get shoehorned into the story, and I just threw them all on the page and then tried to make sense of them. Um, this is probably not something to admit, but I think a potential flaw of the book is that it is a lot of episodes just strung together. I've tried to get a narrative that makes sense and flows through everything, but I still can't help but feel that it's too loose. But that might be because I'm too used to looking at what's there. Anyway, all these memories and experiences got thrown into it to make it book length. And again, some people kind of liked it, so I thought I'd put more effort into it and actually make it into a novel. And this is the end result. I think I just saw an awful lot of nonsense that was going on in the world and decided to roll some of the ideas into this. And the result is this novel about someone who gets catapulted through a ridiculous set of adventures.
Okay. Before we dive too much deeper, we're going to pause for a moment while we shamelessly chauffeur the man, and then we'll dive more deeply into the waters that are The Feather in the Lamp.
Do you like your science fiction with a little bit of naughty and a good helping of comedy? Then pick up your copy of Flux Runners by William Joseph Roberts and join the crew of the Betty in their adventure into the dark unknown. Flux Runners is available through Three Ravens Publishing on Amazon in ebook, paperback, hardback, and on Audible, narrated by Brian Stansberry.
Thank you for sticking with us through that commercial interlude. And I want you to know that despite the rumors, that is not hillbilly singing. I promise. And you're glad. You should be glad that we didn't let him sing. Isn't Three Ravens your publisher as well?
Yes.
Okay, thought so. All right. So you mentioned that the writing course is sort of where the outline came from. But I mean, that's a when answer, not a how did you come up with the idea that became, where did the actual idea come from? Do you remember?
That's a very good question. I've no idea where it came from. I've heard this vague notion that story ideas are like cosmic rays that just pass through the universe and lodge in someone's brain. That's as good an explanation as I can come up with.
Okay. So is this a standalone novel? Do you expect there to be more in this world?
I'm currently working on a sequel, and I have to admit that's harder work than the first book was. But I would like there to be a series if I can find enough readers who are excited and interested in it. I've got a bunch of half or less complete manuscripts kicking about my bottom drawer, and I'm trying to decide what one to tackle after the sequel to this. So who knows if it's going to be another Imperceptibility Happenstance book or something else.
Okay. Are you going to keep with the comically absurd fantasy style?
One of the candidates I've got is a middle grade horror that has comedy elements, but isn't quite as comic as these books. I like the comedy, so I think there's going to be some of that in everything I do. But whether it's quite as heavy-handed as this, I'm not sure.
Okay. So because we mentioned comedy, and that can span the range of bawdy to barracks humor to 12-year-old boy fart jokes, where would you rate the kind of humor you have in your novel?
There is at least one fart joke in this. The invention of hot air flight was a Kalashkin curry, So that gives you the idea of the level of this comedy. There are a lot of subtle and not so subtle digs at things, a lot of really bad puns. As one example, my Karen gatekeeper of the sticks is Australian because the underworld in this book is called the Down Underworld. Low humor.
I mean, I'm here for it. So what would
there's not enough of it.
Well, you could fix that in the sequel. Amp it up to 12. So what would the age range for this novel be as your target audience?
I think it would be anything from 12 to 120. There's nothing that ought to scare off younger readers, though they might miss some of the quantum physics jokes. And as an older reader, I'd be quite happy reading the sort of humor that's in this book. So I think any age range. It's positioned as YA because that's kind of the age of the book's hero. But to me, it doesn't feel like a YA book, because YA books seem to have romance and vampires and dragons. And yeah, okay, this has a dragon, but there's not much of any of the others in it.
So what is it about a YA antagonist or protagonist, I guess, in this case, that drew you in? Like, why not write, I don't know, balding middle-aged dude as your hero, or, frustrated housewife? Like, why write your hero, your main character, as someone at that age range? Was there any specific reason?
I wanted someone fairly naive, sort of coming out into the world. It could have been an older person. Are you familiar with The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy?
I am.
So Arthur Dent is a naive, oldish dude who gets caught up in lots of weird things. The hero of this book could have been an Arthur Dent. I'm not quite sure why I chose to make her a late teens girl, but that just sort of happened.
Okay. So since we're talking about your main character, what can you tell us about her?
She's a daydreamer. She's very into books, knows an awful lot of stuff. Not really very aware of how the real world works. She's a bit of a drifter. Lets things carry her along until she finally realizes that she ought to do something. She ought to take some control to be able to survive and to help others. So she does develop as the story progresses, from a naive daydreamer to someone who can take care of things, though she still has quite a lot of self-doubt.
Okay, that's fair. Do you have any secondary characters that really stick out for you?
There's I mentioned Karen, the Australian god of the underworld. She is a she, is quite important. There's the dragon called Shanks, who's very verbose. He's kind of an alien presence and doesn't understand humans. That's mainly because most of the time he comes across them, they're either running towards him with spears and swords, or running away from him screaming. So he doesn't really know an awful lot about humans, but he's very curious about them. So he sort of comes in and imperceptibility befriends him, and that story develops. So I think those are the main characters. There is someone who briefly appears as a potential love interest, but that deliberately kind of fizzles out as a sort of anti-YA message, where there always seems to be some sort of romance. And I think those are probably the major characters of the book. Oh, and of course the genie who she's tricked into owning, who spends most of the book trying to kill her.
Okay, so for your genie, did you go full, evil original D&D style? Did you go more Aladdin and the Lamp from Disney? Like what was the inspiration for your genie?
He's a cross between Robin Williams and Peter Serafinovich. I couldn't not do a Robin Williams style genie. So he's absolutely a bit like that. He's selfish and devious, and I guess more clumsy than evil.
Okay. Does he dress in traditional genie styles? Nose twitching like he's dreaming. I'm sorry, that was a pun. See, there's a reason I don't write the humor jokes, people. But no. So, like, what did you go for the aesthetic with your genie?
Well, he's not blue, but apart from that, he's probably fairly close to the Disney Aladdin. Am I allowed to say Disney, or is that going to get you sued by the corporation?
No. You're good. You're good. The House of the Mouse is busy with their failing sales numbers anyway, so I don't think they're listening to me. That could be like an evil, like a clan for a villain in a book. The House of the Mouse. We don't even have to say that it's Disney. You can just people would know. That'd be funny. Anyway, see, this is the problem. Everyone's like, what do you do with writer's block? I'm like, what are you talking about, writer's block? How do you turn the ideas off?
Yes, they keep getting in the way. I think one reason that I like short stories is that I can produce something quickly, not necessarily complete it, but at least produce a skeleton and get that idea out of my head so that I can focus on the thing I'm supposed to be doing.
Yeah, I like short stories because that's what I first was introduced to reading. My sisters were both Girl Scouts, and so I was the tag along. And yes, that's the official title of the siblings get stuck going on these trips. And I remember when I was doing that, they would be like Reader's Digest. Somebody would always bring one of the Reader's Digest version of all the stories to keep all of us entertained. And so I read a lot of, more classic literature, but in condensed versions. And so it just made me appreciate that way of telling stories, in the short story sort of format.
Does Reader's Digest still exist? I remember reading lots of those years ago. I'm
not sure. And I don't even know. Is Reader's Digest the same company that owns Publishers Clearinghouse? I don't know. We're showing our age here, though. All I know is Ed McMahon never showed up at my doorstep with a check.
I remember they had an awful lot of weird stories like, I am Bobby Spleen. Some random organ in someone's body would be telling a story.
Yeah, I mean, they were trying to be educational, too.
Yeah,
that was a big thing for a while. I mean, heck, even in the 90s, you had Jerry Springer trying to end his trash show, which was entertaining, but then they tried to end with a point because everything had to be a learning moment. In that time, it was just a moment in time. So, well, since we've diverted briefly, I'm going to have to ask. So, because whenever we have a guest with an accent, everyone wants to know where it's from. So, can you satisfy all of those people since they made it through halfway of the episode? Where's your accent from?
I grew up in Northern Ireland, though I've been in England for, I guess, now more time than I've been in Northern Ireland. So this is a Londonderry accent that's been somewhat diluted by 20, 30 years in East Anglia in England.
There you go, people. Now you don't have to send me emails. I've actually gotten a few. I like that guest. Where's their accent from? And I'm like, I don't know. Ask them.
I guess my accent's a problem. I have to concentrate to speak slowly, and even then, I'm probably not completely intelligible. I keep saying I've got the sort of voice that works in silent movies.
Me too. What's that they say? The face for radio and the voice for print.
Yeah.
I don't know. My problem is I tend to speak really fast. They called me motor mouth as a kid for a reason. So I have to make myself.
Too many ideas coming through too quickly.
Yeah, I have to. And it got worse after the head injury because you want to get it out before you forget. So I have to concentrate really hard on speaking slow. I don't know if you remember the old Micro Machine commercials where the guy was the auctioneer voice and he would lead.
Yes.
I used to keep up with him. I used to be able to do that. I mean, it's not exactly a useful talent, but so yeah, I have to concentrate on speaking slow. I don't think I have an accent though. I don't know. Do you think Americans have accents, given that you're not from
definitely. The only voice that doesn't have an accent is the people with the Queen's English receive pronunciation. Everything else has an accent. I'm sure there's a sort of standard American accent that is a default, but America is such a large country that everything deviates from that, really.
So there was speculation, especially that it could have happened during COVID, but just in general, that at a certain point our accents will all coalesce into just one standard. And there was a joke that it was going to be that old-timey radio voice accent that they did. in the early days of radio. Of course, nobody realizes that's not a real accent. They did that because they had to speak to the vocal range of the actual microphones.
Yes, yeah.
And if Nick Garber was here, he's one of my co-hosts. He could actually do that voice. I just can't.
Well,
But,
I think since television became widespread, most accents are kind of smooshed together a bit.
Yeah, I think so too. Which is a shame because I think there's something cool about the variety of accents you can get.
Mm.
So it'll be interesting to see what happens.
In them.
Yeah, it'll be interesting because I know that's one of the speculations you see a lot in science fiction, at least, is what's going to happen, to the accents. Will we retain regional accents? Will we develop new ones?
Well, it's going to keep evolving and changing. I think that's the only thing that we can say. I think as long as the world is divided up into separate tribes, there are still going to be separate languages and accents.
I think so. I think the only limitation is the vocal range of the average human voice. Because obviously you can't beat biology when it comes to that. But all right, so back to the feather in the lamp. I always, when I heard the accents, I should have asked in the beginning, and I was thinking like, oh man, I was kicking myself for that because I know I was going to get the messages. But okay, so you've got the main character. I don't know if you told us her name though.
Imperceptibility happenstance. And no, I've no idea where that came from either. I do play with names quite a lot in this book. There's a kind of drawn accountant sort of guy who's called Mr. Nameless. There are a few people in the book who make jokes about imperceptibility's name because it's so complicated to say. So yes, I like silly names and making fun of them.
So do you have a nickname that she goes by, or does everyone call her
Itty?
What's that?
Itty, ITTY.
Okay.
Which is much more easy.
Okay. Your narrator is going to hate you. I'm just telling you. Is this coming out in audiobook? I know
it already is.
Okay. Did you get hate mail from him or her?
From her. No, there were a few places in the book where I changed the wording slightly to make it easier for her. But imperceptibility's name stuck.
Okay. I have been known to insert random names just to see if they could get through like the publishing house and then make the narrator have to say it. I actually had my first narrator call me and he's like, no, JR, we're not doing this. Change it. I'm like, okay, I'm surprised it made it that far, but okay, I'll change it.
Apparently there was some word or phrase that Stephen Fry couldn't pronounce from the Harry Potter books, and J.K. Rowling made sure that she put that phrase in every single one of them that he narrated.
Oh, that's just mean. Although I get it. I do that kind of stuff too, but I never know who the narrator is going to be. So I'm just curious to see what makes it through. Like I had some of the authors that I've met since I started writing are from Sri Lanka. And I know because I've had trouble pronouncing their names, I gave them a nickname because, between being hard of hearing with the tendonitis and then everything, I was like, oh, I'm just going to see what the narrator can do. And they came back with, no, we'll shorten this somehow. So with your narrator, did she go with sort of an accent similar to yours, a European accent? Did she make up new ones for these characters? Like, how did you pick the cadence of the?
So the only fixed point. Actually, I'll take a step back. I generally find it difficult to picture most of my characters. I think I focus on plot and ideas more than the characters themselves. So imperceptibility's description in the book came quite late in the process. But because of that, I also didn't have a particularly strong view of what anyone sounded like, apart from the one character who had to be absolutely Australian. So as long as the narrator could do a good, almost caricature of an Australian accent, that was fine. Everything else was what she felt she could do. The dragon had to have a reasonably deep voice because he's a big beast. But apart from that, I really had no strong ideas.
Okay. So when you write, do you, like, sometimes we obviously make up words. Do you have pronunciations in mind, or are you not that picky?
I'm To be honest, I've never really thought about it. The dragon has got a ridiculously long, complicated name, which I thought even I could pronounce properly, and I don't think I've really thought that much about how anything else really needs to be pronounced.
Okay, that's
I
fair.
probably haven't put in that many complicated words anyway.
That's fair. Did you like? Normally we would ask you about the bad guy, but obviously we don't want spoilers. So what can you tell us about the antagonist in this novel without giving anything away? Because obviously we want the readers to go out and buy and read the book.
So I've already mentioned the genie who's essentially trying to kill her, and that's not much of a spoiler since it's pretty obvious from early on. It's probably also not a spoiler to say that he doesn't succeed. He's the bad guy who runs through the entire book, but he doesn't actually have a huge presence in it. There are a few other sort of bad guys who come and go when most of the antagonism is something that gets resolved. So someone who turns out who starts off being a bad guy ends up maybe not being such a bad person. Apart from one character who's much more interested in wealth and power than in people. Everyone else is kind of trying to do the best for their particular society, and that just happens to rub up against what imperceptibility wants.
Okay, so with the dragon with the ridiculously long and complicated name, is he like? Is it a dragon like in Pern where they can ride it, or is it massive? Well, you already said it's massive, so like, what's the role in the story other than just being a dragon? Do you ride it?
Well, yeah, his first appearance is as someone who's going to eat her, because that's what humans think dragons do. But she ends up befriending him, and yes, he does get used for transport. Actually, I guess that's his main role in this book. In the sequel, he starts doing different things. But yes, he's a convenient and intelligent transport.
It's like a lovable horse that actually talks back and flies. Got it.
Yeah, I guess so. That's an interesting way to look at it.
Okay, so what is this? Obviously you've got dragons, but is there magic in this world aside from the genie?
There's a mention of spells, but there's not really a huge amount of magic. It's more like, I guess, distorted science. The dragon's magic is traveling through the quantum domain, which is kind of inspired by quantum physics ideas, but obviously not realistic in the slightest. I think in this book, there are a few, I guess, translations between domains which are kind of magic-ish. I'm sorry for being very vague and hand-wavy, but I don't want to give spoilers.
Oh, that's absolutely okay.
There's not really very much in the way of conventional spells at all, just the genies.
Okay, so what level of technology is in this world? Obviously, there's an Age of Sail ship. Do they got gunpowder and guns? Is it like steampunk vibe, pure medieval fantasy?
It's sort of medieval with anachronistic bits of technology. So there is balloon flight, and the company who make these airships are starting to work on fixed wing aircraft. There's the start of gunpowder and weapons based on that, but it's all fairly low level, fairly primitive medieval sort of stuff. Besides that.
Okay. So have you put a lot of thought into how that technology will change if they develop gunpowder and flight in that respect?
Well, in the sequel, they end up going to the moon, which involves aspects of both of those. So I'm kind of pushing and stretching at the ideas to see how they fit into this world, and pushing them into the ridiculous.
Okay. Well, that's the great thing about hand wavy. I'm in magic is it can be the forgiver of all things if you sell it right.
Yes, as long as you can produce some sort of logic that, while not plausible, follows a sequence.
Yeah. So is this world mostly water or is it mostly land? Like, what is the role of the sea in this story? Because it is on the cover.
Yeah, so there are several domains that imperceptibility goes through. She does spend some time on a ship, and that just had a nice aesthetic for the cover. She also spends some time in dark underground tunnels. That's kind of difficult to make a nice picture out of.
Yeah.
She comes from a desert city, but doesn't actually spend much time there. She probably spends more time in mountains and in a particular valley and a large city. The cover was just one aspect of that looked nice.
Now you said different dimensions. Do you mean like areas within the map of the world where the story is told, or are they going to different worlds through the course of the story?
Without giving any spoilers, most of what I'm talking about is being different parts of the world, but there are also kind of different dimensions. Like there is an afterworld, and a few other strange places that she ends up being dropped into.
All right. So you mentioned Afterworld, and that gets me thinking about your underworld. What made you decide to make it Australia?
The god awful pun that I could get away with, or that I hope I can get away with. It just struck me that calling the place the Down Underworld was too silly to pass up on, and that made her Australian.
Did you fit in at least one crikey?
I've got a few good days. I might have a blimey. I think I've got a crikey. I could bring up the manuscript and check, but it's probably not worth trying to do that.
No. I'm just picturing Crocodile Dundee and who's the guy? Steve Irwin, I think, was the famous outdoorsman.
Yes. Yeah. I think pretty much all that I know about Australian culture is Crocodile Dundee. One of the things that worried me about the book was accidentally offending Australians by doing too much with stereotypes. I'm fascinated by the dreaming, and I had thought of including some aspect of that in the book, but realized that I couldn't do it justice. I might be causing offense, so I just cut that bit. But I stuck with the crikeys and the barbecues.
Okay. So, only thing I know about Australia is everything there wants to kill you.
Yes.
And even the things that can't kill you would if they could. So there's that. And I remember because I'm writing a series with Australian characters from their military. And so I had some of their former service members from Australia reading those sections because I wanted to get it right. And, they said, "Hey, JR, have you heard of sensitivity readers?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I don't use them." But he said, "Well, for Australia, you need an insensitivity reader because you need to amp this up." And so it's a funny balance when you want to write true to form Australians. It's like I could write how they speak, but then the Amazon censors in America would not like some of the words they use because they use different. Like we use the F word a lot in America as the main curse word. They use a vulgar term that starts with a C. And so like that sort of raises some flags. So it's kind of funny where the lines are for each of the countries.
Yes. I'm a member of a critiquing site, and I did make sure that I got a bunch of Australian members of that site to have a look at the Australian parts of this book. And I think, touch wood, I got away without offending people too much.
So is touch wood a British expression for knocking on wood?
I guess so. I'm not familiar with knocking wood, but it's certainly touching wood for luck. Yeah.
Okay. There you go. We're all learning something together there, dear listener.
Not that it has any bearing in reality, but still.
No, absolutely. So are you going to use the same cover artist for the sequel? Because that is, that art is awesome. I could see that framed on a wall.
Yeah, I certainly am. He's waiting for me to work out what things I want on the cover. I think this time, given that there is a trip to the moon, the moon could be the big centerpiece rather than the ruby.
Right.
with maybe a spaceship in front of it rather than a dragon, but I haven't quite got that far.
So is this an actual watercolor painting, or is it just the pastiche he gave it?
This is all digital work.
Oh, it definitely looks like it's a watercolor.
Yes, like I said earlier, he's talented. He's done a really good job with this.
Normally, I don't gush as much over covers because when you're colorblind, you just don't see the things the way the rest of the world does. But this one works for me, so well done. Even like I said, those layers of texture that made it look like the water was moving.
Yes, I did contemplate asking him to produce some sort of movie file or GIF which had the waves moving, but haven't got around to that yet.
Okay, that's a nice looking cover. I would frame that and put that on your wall if I was you. So. But so that's pretty cool. Was there anything about the feather in the lamp that we didn't talk about that you think the readers and listeners and viewers should know before they go out and buy this book?
No, I think they should all rush out and buy it immediately and give me nicer reviews on that website that begins with A. It is a light comedy. It should be a quick read. I hope people find it as funny as I did. Which maybe is a strange thing to say, but I write first for me. It's the sort of book I would like to read, and I hope others like to read it too.
Okay. Now, is this? I know Three Ravens is in the process of going wide. Is this book wide, or is it Amazon exclusive?
It's wide. It's definitely not exclusive.
Okay. All right. So this is the part of the interview, dear listener, dear viewer, where I remind you to please be kind and speak your mind on the reviewing platforms. Your reviews help the right readers find the right book. So do your part. And as someone who has his debut novel, those reviews are especially important because they help raise in the algorithms, which helps get visibility, which helps drive traffic and all the things that computers do in the background. I don't worry about computers. I just do the hand wavium. But the reviews really do help, and if you can't leave a review, tell a friend, tell a dozen friends, do your part and spread the word. And if you don't have a dozen friends, start a website and write a review there. I mean, I'm assuming everyone's got a dozen friends, but I don't know. I don't know. Like, I do online friends count? Because sometimes I feel like we don't leave our houses anymore.
Yes, it's become very easy to do that, hasn't it?
It has. So with the sequel, do you have an estimated, like, I think I'll be done around this time kind of schedule for it, or are you just sussing it out? Because obviously you don't want to wait 7 years.
Definitely not. I've got a vague aim of end of this year to make it pretty much the anniversary of this first book. Whether I hit that or not is a different matter. I'm in the second draft stage at the moment, though there's a few fairly fundamental things that need to be sorted out. So maybe fingers crossed, knocking on wood again, end of the year.
Okay. Okay, that's actually pretty reasonable. What length are these stories? Because YA sometimes is shorter.
Yeah, the Feather in the Lamp is something like 75,000 words. And I'm aiming at similar for the sequel.
Okay. Now, do you feel like this world has enough room that if the sequel sells, you could do I would say trequel, but that's not really a word, turn it into a trilogy?
I think beyond the second book, it might even become a series. The way I'm currently thinking of the ending of the second book is leaving it fairly open to travel much further than a single book would lead. I'm kind of looking at each book in the series as being standalone-ish, though it helps if you've read the ones before.
Okay. So episodic more than sequential?
Yes, I think so. I mean, the characters from the earlier books appear in the sequels. So you'd kind of miss out on where they met if you skip the earlier books, but my aim is that that's pretty much all.
Okay. Would you live in this world if you could?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think I'd miss Netflix and the like too much.
Okay. If you could bring anything from that world into your world for your daily experiencing, would you have a pet dragon? Would you take some of the magic? What would you do?
I'd absolutely have dragons. I'd absolutely have these quantum dragons popping up everywhere.
Now, when you say quantum dragons, and you've talked about that briefly earlier, are they actually going through alternate space, or is that just a name?
The Handwavium says that they live in the higher dimensions of our universe. So, string theory claims there are, I don't know, 11 dimensions, something like that. They spend most of the time in those higher dimensions, which is why we don't see them. And they just occasionally pop into the lower dimensions to interact with humans. So that's kind of how they get about. They just pop into these higher dimensions, do weird probability smoothing things, and pop up somewhere else.
Okay, there you go. That is definitely interesting. Love the cover. We appreciate you coming on. And if someone wanted to know more and they wanted to stalk you, follow you on the interwebs, how would they go about doing that?
So I've got a Facebook page. That's pretty much my only social network presence. I've got a Linktree page which lists everywhere you can find me and all of the books I've appeared in. I've got short stories in a bunch of anthologies and other places, as well as the novel, of course. So Linktree is probably the best place to start.
All right. And as he updates any social media links, because we do record these in advance, but as he updates any of that, I will get it as accurate as possible on the day of launch. But the Linktree will be the main source for everything. And for him, that is Linktree, linktr.ee/L.L.N.Hunter. So Linktree /LN Hunter with periods between the initials. And there you go. That'll be an easy way to find him. Speaking of finding people and stalking them online, as you do, you can find us on our Linktree at linktr.ee, Linktree /Blasters and Blades podcast. Again, Linktree /Blasters and Blades podcast. We have a BitChute there, Rumble, Twitter, which is at SF_fantasy_show, Sierra Foxtrot _fantasy_show. We do have an email at Blasters and Blades podcast at gmail.com. Again, Blasters and Blades podcast at gmail.com. We will be updating the Linktree with Madam Stabby Stab's Instagram and Twitter, that's where she is on both. So if you want to send hate mail, she finds that stuff comical, but she watches horror movies for fun, so she's not right in the head. And with that said, you can join us on Facebook where all the shenanigans happen. Facebook.com/groups/Blasters and Blades podcast. Noticing a theme here, people? Blasters and Blades podcast. Everywhere cool people hang out. Speaking of hanging out, we have a website at anchor.fm/blasters-and-blades. Again, anchor.fm/blasters-and-blades, where for as little as 99 cents a month, you can help keep the lights on. Or you could support the show more directly over at buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Again, buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley, where be sure to put in the comment section that it is for the podcast, and I will keep my co-hosts, Doc Cisca, Madam Stabby, and Nick Garber duly caffeinated. They will drink until the brown Java gold pours out of their eyeballs. You should write that in a scene. Wait, hold on. Before we close this out, do you have coffee or tea in your world?
There is coffee. There is strong Kaleshkin coffee. Don't think there's much tea. Actually, no, there is tea. There are a bunch of herbal teas as well.
Okay, and we're adding
different favorite hot beverages.
Okay. So I'm supposed to be adding this to the religion questions, but I forgot. So coffee or tea, sir?
Definitely coffee. Although I'm living in England, I can't stand tea at all.
Ooh, my people. All right, how do you take your coffee?
Black, but that's mainly laziness rather than actual taste.
Okay, if you weren't being lazy, how would you take your coffee?
I think it'll depend on the bitterness of the coffee. Sometimes very milky and sweet, sometimes just bitter and black.
Okay. Dark like your soul. All right, we can dig that. In the future, those will start getting inserted in the beginning. I started learning a little bit about British tea. There is a YouTube channel called Tea and Metals, and they start off with a mug of tea, and they talk about how they take their tea, and then use a lot of words I don't always understand, and then they talk about whatever military story brought them there. So it's kind of cool. If you're interested in military history and you want, non-American perspective, I recommend that channel.
And it includes tea.
And it includes tea, which is kind of weird. But what are you going to do? We threw it in the harbor for a reason, because coffee is better.
Definitely. Actually, I think in America, coffee is definitely better because with your lower electrical voltage, it's more difficult to make water hot enough to make decent tea. So I'm led to believe.
So the heat of the tea is what makes it taste better, because you still got to let it cool down enough that it doesn't burn your mouth.
Yeah, but it's got to be really boiling to begin with. So I gather I'm not a tea expert. Like I said, I can't stand this stuff.
Okay. I don't know. I just use a kettle on the stove, boil the water, pour it in. Or if I'm being really lazy when I drink tea, I'll use my Keurig and just, not put a coffee pot in there. Although sometimes that'll give the flavor of the last coffee. So sometimes your tea will have, but I've never had a complaint. So anyway, all right. Thank you for spending some of your precious time with us. For the absentee Nick Garber and Doc Cisca, I am J.R. Handley, and this was the Blasters and Blades podcast. We'll be back next week at the same time, where we'll indulge our love of nerd culture, cheesy jokes, and all things that go boom. Thank you for coming, Mr. Hunter. We appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
All right, and we're out.